David Graeber has a critique on the myth of barter that's part of this amazing book that I've been reviewing. And the way he characterizes how economists think about the myth of barter is not the way I think about the myth of barter as an economist. And yet, he and I agree on a ton of things. And I think actually thinking through the differences in our perspective on this myth is really helpful and fruitful for thinking about the bigger task of rethinking economic myth. Now, the thing he's trying to do in critiquing the myth of barter is something that I think is absolutely essential, and I think he is very successful in doing that with his critique. So by the end of this video, it will come across like we agree more than we disagree, even on the myth of barter. But I'm going to start out with the disagreement, and the disagreement will still remain at the end of the video, and of course that's where the interesting part is, right? The contention. So what is the myth of barter? And this is going to be a thought experiment that's introduced when trying to get people to think about how money works, where you have this little town with a baker and a candlestick maker and a shoemaker, and they each want something from one of the others, but the baker wants a candlestick and the candlestick maker wants some shoes, but they can't quite make it transact. They would need to have this complicated set of credit interactions between them to make these trades go smoothly. Now, at this point, I need to stop the story and make a revision, because I've just brought up complicated credit arrangements between people. And that is a very abstract, hard to think about kind of thing, which doesn't work well for economic myth. Economic myth is best for people's understanding of things if it's visualizable, if you can visualize people doing things, people interacting with each other, instead of some arrangement that's on a paper. I also need to point out here that if we are going to move into a healthier economic system in the future, then it is going to also rely on economic myth. People are going to have ways of understanding how that healthier system works. And I do believe in the possibility of a healthier economic system. I wouldn't be doing this channel if I didn't think that was possible. And understanding good and bad economic myth is going to be part of the process for envisioning something better. So I'm pointing out here that the abstract notion of credit arrangements is not great myth. And that's, of course, where barter comes in. So instead of imagining the complicated credit arrangement, we imagine the baker actually going to the candlestick maker and trying to make a deal, but the candlestick maker doesn't want bread right now, and maybe we could bring in the shoemaker because the candlestick maker does want bread, and we're imagining these people having this complicated interaction where they're trying to figure things out. So basically, barter is a visualizable version of credit arrangements. That's the role it's playing in this economic myth. So we back up and revise how we're telling this story to not mention complicated credit arrangements and instead convey the same idea with the image in our head of barter. Now, how does the myth of barter end? And the myth of barter ends with money coming in and saving the day by smoothing this transaction so that these weird conversations about trading and barter, such that those don't need to happen. Money will accomplish that without the necessity of this weird setup. That's the myth of barter, and its purpose is to convey the notion that money smooths transactions, that is one of the roles that money plays. Now, I will pose the question to you, which is the question he begs in this book. Do we need money to play this particular role in an economy? Is that necessary? Now, I want to say that there are actually a lot of things that he and I agree about when it comes to money. So money is actually playing a pretty pernicious role in the current economy. Now, it does multiple things. It does some of this transaction smoothing, but it also feeds some of the power to the powerful dynamic that I complain about on this channel. The role of money in our system, the way it currently works, is a huge problem, and I'm not fully going to explain that in this video. He and I also agree that we are living through a transitional moment in economic history, and that to rethink the way our system works, we need creative thinking. We need to rethink money itself, how that works, what that could look like in the future. Could there be a system without money? These are all things he and I very much agree upon. And one of the reasons I bring this up is I think his perspective on the myth of barter and his critique on the myth of barter is coming from a place of trying to solve problems with our current system. With that in mind, I want to give his depiction of the myth of barter, and then my depiction of the myth of barter, and why I think there is an irony in the way he's critiquing this. So his critique of the myth of barter is that he's portraying it as if economists think this is a literal depiction of history, that it literally happened like this. And let me give you a quote. "We did not begin with barter, discover money, and then eventually develop credit systems. It happened precisely the other way around." And this is actually the most brilliant contribution of his book, is to go on this wild goose chase throughout history to figure out how did money evolve, how did credit systems play a role throughout history, and his contribution in figuring out, wait a second, credit systems came first, this tracking of this complicated interactions between the people in a community, in a small community, that happened first in tribes throughout history, and that money came second, and that barter came third. He's depicting that in history. That is a brilliant contribution to this whole problem. But he does this by saying economists think people first started with barter, and then money came along, and then we have credit systems, which is not at all the way I think. For me, this is in no way a literal myth. This is a thought experiment to get people thinking about the role money plays, how it works. It's not about literal history. Now, he does read carefully when he's reading these texts about the myth of barter from economists. So let me give him credit for that, and I'll give you a quote on that. "It is important to emphasize that this is not presented as something that actually happened, but as a purely imaginary exercise." When I read that quote, I was like, bingo, this is exactly how to think about it. But I think this dispute between us raises the question of, does economic myth need to be literally true about history? Is that something that's necessary when we're rethinking what myth could look like in the future? Because of course there have been many societies throughout history that have economic myths that are not literally true, where those societies are way healthier than our current society. Which is not to say that they're perfect. There's never existed a perfect set of economic myths or a perfect society. But this question is one I think we need to think more carefully about. And I think the answer is actually not going to be a straightforward yes or no. But here's why I think his position on this is kind of ironic. This is because to get us out of the rut of thinking that he's trying to get us out of in this book, one useful exercise, one useful thought experiment is, can you imagine a system without money? In some ways, I think he's calling us to do that thought experiment, which is something that I've done. I think everyone should do. Even if you think there might be money in the future, there is value to thought experiments that pull us out of our current rut. And here's the problem. When you do that, you need a set of economic myths that would help people to move into a really different style of system. Because economic myths help people understand how that system works. And so you're like, what kind of economic myth could sustain a system without money? And I would not rule out the myth of barter itself in that kind of system. I absolutely would not rule that out. And if you approach that with the caveat that whatever economic myth you come up with, it has to be either literally true or presented in a way as if it's totally fictional. If you put that criteria on any economic myth we might come up with in the future, those criteria are so stifling and I think unreasonably so. So that's the gist of my critique on his depiction of the myth of barter. So what is economic myth? I still have not defined that in this video. So let me give you a definition that I'll use at least for this video that I think is decent enough. It's an economic myth is a set of stories, anecdotes, moral frames, and perceptions that shape the flow of scarce resources. And economic myths help people to understand the system they live inside. So of course, the myth of barter, I think, is one myth from among a huge constellation of economic myths that sustain our current system. In this book, he also talks about the moral frame around the importance of paying back one's debt, especially for low-income people, but not so much for large-scale institutions. That's another part of the economic myth of our current system. I might point out the economic myth is not always recognizable in that way. For example, in societies that have a strong sense of the Sabbath, that you take a rest on the Sabbath, you do not work on the Sabbath, that is definitely an economic myth because it will shape the flow of scarce resources. People are not going to create scarce resources during that one day of the week that is the Sabbath. And of course, I've done a couple of other videos on economic myth, which I will link to below. Now, what determines if an economic myth is valid or invalid? And I actually want to take these two things separately because I think we get different insights from looking at it from the two different perspectives. So we'll start with what makes an economic myth valid. And the answer there is somewhat straightforward, I think, which is, does this economic myth support a system that is healthier than our current system? Does it support a system that holds the power to the powerful dynamic in check, that orients itself around human values and ecosystem health and all of that? Does it support a system that creates more balance? Now, one problem this brings up is the constellation problem. It's the fact that any system is supported by an entire constellation of economic myths that have relationships with each other, where if you remove one of the economic myths from one constellation and put it into a different constellation, that economic myth has a different role. So how do you evaluate myths? Do you have to evaluate the whole constellation together? And I'm not going to solve this problem, I'm just pointing it out. But let's flip the question and ask instead, what makes an economic myth invalid? Because I do think there are invalid economic myths. And as you might have gathered, I don't think the literal historical truth of an economic myth is really the key question here. It's something else. So I think that a particular economic myth can be invalid if it creates a misperception about how our system works, or if it creates some kind of cover for the power to the powerful dynamic to do something without people noticing how invalid and how unjust that thing is. So if a particular economic myth is playing that role of misleading people and deceiving people and eschewing accountability, then that economic myth is invalid. And I would like to look again at the myth of barter with that criteria in mind, because doing so is actually, I think, going to redeem Graeber just a bit. But before doing that, I want to look at two different purposes of reevaluating economic myth, because sometimes one of these purposes can seem at odds with the other, or sometimes even be at odds with the other. This also gets at the main source of value of his critique of the myth of barter. So what are these two tasks? And the first one is going to be waking people up to the fact that our system is so destructive, so unhealthy, that it's not serving human values, all of that. That's one of the tasks. And as part of that task, it's in what ways is the current economic myth set sustaining that unhealthy system? Now, I do want to point out here that our economic myth framework is actually evolving. It is not a static thing. That's going to be pretty important, I think, in the long run. But for now, I'm not going to go there. I'm just pointing out that one of the two tasks is waking people up to the relationship between economic myth and the destruction that they experience in their lives. The second task is going to be constructing a healthier system. And the hope here, of course, would be that we could collapse towards something that is much healthier, that has checks against the power to the powerful dynamic, all of that stuff. That task is going to require a different set of economic myths that people have thought through. And to be clear, I do not think that this new system will arrive in anybody's brain fully formed. It's going to be distributed across many different people who are thinking critically about the situation. I'm just setting up these two tasks as the tasks involved in rethinking economic myth. And these two tasks are only going to be at odds with each other when you do a sloppy job. So what is a sloppy job? A sloppy job of doing task number one is latching on to anything that discredits our current system. It's like, okay, if it discredits the current system, let's grab it. It's the truth. Let's hold on to it. That is really sloppy because sometimes you're taking a concept that has one use in our current system, but has many other possible uses. And you're cutting off all of that possibility for the purpose of achieving task number one in a way that actually reduces our ability to accomplish task number two. Now, I am not accusing him of sloppy thinking, not at all. As a matter of fact, I think his main contribution that he's making with his critique of the myth of barter is not about task number 1. His main contribution is about task number 2. It's about opening people's minds to envision something really, really different. And I will point out, task number 2 is way harder than task number 1, which is why I want to give him so much credit despite my slight disagreement here. And let me give you a quote from the book that sort of backs up my perspective that he is really oriented around task number 2 more than task number 1. What I have been trying to do in this book is not so much to propose a vision of what precisely the next age will be like, but to throw open perspectives, enlarge our sense of possibilities, to begin to ask what it would mean to start thinking on a breadth and with a grandeur appropriate to the times. He's trying to throw open perspectives in a way that will get people thinking creatively about different possibilities. And that is really a task 2 type of thing. So my view on this is if people interpret his critique on the myth of barter as being about task number 1, they're not understanding his real contribution. But let's return to the myth of barter and evaluate it according to my criteria for what makes a myth invalid. And of course, my criteria here is, does it create a misperception or a misleading account of how the economy actually works? Or does it divert people's attention from something that would otherwise hold the system accountable? And I'm going to give 3 evaluations, 2 of which will support the myth of barter, 1 of which will support his critique. Evaluation number 1. The myth of barter conveys the fact that money smooths transactions to avoid complicated credit arrangements between people. Does that rule of the myth of barter have any credence? And my answer to that is yes. Actually, money really does this in the current environment. I agree with him that small communities can keep track of credit arrangements, but that can't be done with large global systems without something accomplishing that task of smoothing these transactions. If we want to move to a healthier system, we are going to need something else besides money as we know it to accomplish that thing. And in my view, the myth of barter helps us to focus on that thing that needs to be accomplished. It can be one little tool in our imaginary mindsets to help us rethink what the system would need to do. However, and this gets at my second evaluation of the myth of barter, this is not the only thing that money does. As a matter of fact, money definitely feeds this power to the powerful dynamic. The way money as we currently know it is used in our system actually does have some pretty pernicious aspects to it. And the myth of barter does not convey any of those bad things about what money is doing. So the question is this a point against the myth of barter or a point for the myth of barter, or neither? And I'm actually going to put it in the third category, where I do not think every single economic myth needs to point out every single aspect of one part of the economy. I think each economic myth can do just one thing, where people's understanding about other aspects can be captured by other myths, other examples, other anecdotes. So for me, this is not a mark against the myth of barter. My third and final evaluation here is that the myth of barter creates an intuition in people that money is necessary. And in many ways, I think this is the contribution of his book. He is pushing back against that particular aspect of the myth of barter. He's saying, actually, money is not necessary to smooth interactions because small communities throughout history have done a fantastic job of arranging things through credit arrangements and through their interpersonal relationships without the use of money. That is the main aspect of the myth of barter that he is pushing back against. And I think that is an incredibly valuable and useful contribution. I think he's right about that critique of the myth of barter. And so that aspect of the myth of barter does need to be rethought. The way to rethink it is to read his book. And this also points out that this book is aimed at the people who want to be creative thinkers about possible systems in the future. That's most of my evaluation here. There's really just two other aspects I want to point out that will help you to understand my perspective on this. And one is the notion that ideas, and ideas includes myths, it includes stories and anecdotes. Ideas can be tools, they can be weapons, they can be shields, they can be instruments. Any given idea does not only have one role it can play. And as an example, you might consider racism. The concept of racism opens your eyes to seeing things that are actually otherwise really hard to see if you don't have language to talk about them. But these are very real dynamics that are sometimes really subtle, sometimes really overt. They manifest themselves in different ways. So having language around racism is really important as an instrument, as a telescope or a microscope for seeing things you couldn't otherwise see. And yet, racism can also be used as a weapon. And I think one dynamic we have going on is that people will see a concept being weaponized in a way. They'll look at that and they'll be like, that concept is being weaponized. That concept is not good. Let's throw it out. But they end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater because that concept used in a different context can enlighten them in ways that are so important and so profound. And so throwing things out, throwing out ideas, throwing out myths is something to be really, really careful with. And as a matter of fact, my perspective is we don't throw anything out. We might take something and we might critique it, we might evaluate it, we might set it aside. We don't want to latch on to any concept. We don't want to completely reject any concept. We want to just hold lightly to many, many different concepts. And that's how we prepare ourselves to actually envision something better. And the last bit I wanted to say is to explain why I do not engage in debunking myths. And this is mainly because debunking is a very binary way of thinking, and I am convinced binary thinking is one of the main problems we have going on in the world, where binary thinking is placing everything into a true-false framework, whereas in fact something can be true in one context and false from a different perspective. And this is not a rejection of truth. I think things can be closer to the truth or farther away from the truth, and they can be deeper truths or more shallow truths, where the depth of a truth oftentimes depends on how many perspectives you've taken into account. Have you taken into account enough perspectives to see that sometimes something is true in one case and the opposite is true in another case, and you can integrate those different perspectives into your thinking? This is, of course, an insight that Ian McGilchrist goes into in his book, The Matter with Things, which is such an important book for thinking about all of these issues together.